Thomas Jefferson successfully handed off power to his Democratic-Republican protege, James Madison. In doing so, he put behind the ugliness of Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts, Hamilton's ploy to prevent Jefferson from rising to power, and the trial to determine whether Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, had committed treason against his nation. Western expansion was in full swing, with most indigenous nations displaying at least a willingness to give Jefferson's America the benefit of the doubt regarding their treaty obligations. The handoff in power was seamless, with Madison defeating Federalist candidate Charles Pinckney decisively. The nation's fourth president was widely regarded to be one of the most brilliant political minds of the Revolution. He had written 29 of the 85 Federalist Papers, advocating throughout them for a large republic with a diverse population, emphasizing the importance of checks and balances in order to ensure the separation of powers, as well as writing for the consideration of and maintenance of states' rights. He was a serious and humorless man, traits that would be commonplace across America over the course of his first term, which would witness 3 North American capitals burned to the ground. You're listening to A Push Through History, a resource designed for students taking the AP U.S. History course. This episode covers the second major concept embedded within Period 4, 1800 to 1848, coming apart at the seams. James Madison had always been a powerful advocate for the Constitution. Although he was the architect of the Bill of Rights, his friend John Beckley worried that Madison would prove to be too timid and indecisive as a statesman, more capable of being the man who supported the individual destined to make the final decisions. His decision-making ability was first put to the test by Tecumseh, a Shawnee tribal leader who had steadfastly refused to cede territory to the ambitious territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison. By hook or by crook, Harrison had managed to convince the indigenous peoples of the land of Indians to cede more than 3 million acres of tribal land to the United States. Tecumseh's brother, known throughout history as the Prophet, set up a new confederation of Indians who desired to hold on to their ancestral lands. Tecumseh himself explained eloquently, asking others to form one body, one heart, and defend to the last warrior our country, our homes, our liberty, and the graves of our fathers. The 2 Shawnee warriors set up their new intra-tribal arrangement in the burgeoning capital city of Prophetstown, a holy city which revolved around an anti-white, anti-alcohol agenda. Understanding that those who didn't understand the past were doomed to repeat it, Tecumseh asked his followers, "Where today are the Pequot? Where are the other powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man." It was only a matter of time before he knew that his people were destined to be removed from their lands. He instinctively knew that the independent nations had no chance against what was a United States. He initially gained recruits from the Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw peoples after a huge comet had appeared overhead in Alabama upon his appearance. The earth itself seemed to shake at the arrival and departure of this great Indian chief, as a series of violent earthquakes spread throughout the Midwest and South while he was preaching his warning regarding the coming storm. Had he not sought out allies, his nation would have surely been swallowed whole by the encroaching American settlers. Yet it was his decision to unite the tribes of the Mississippi Valley to the northern and southern indigenous natives, which would ultimately prove to be his undoing. In 1811, Tecumseh personally left the capital of Prophetstown to travel down the Mississippi River in order to persuade another nation to join his growing alliance. Only after he was away did Harrison and 1,000 soldiers march upon Prophetstown, resulting in the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Native Confederation gave as good as it got, but the burning of Prophetstown was a significant blow to the morale of Tecumseh's Confederacy, which had naively believed that their leaders had some sort of magical way of protecting them. Although a significant number of supporters abandoned the Confederacy, Tecumseh and the Prophet continued their now hopeless war against Western encroachment. In these subsequent skirmishes, as well as during the raid on Prophetstown, Harrison's soldiers discovered advanced British guns. Although it was possible that such firepower had been stolen, traded for illegally, or perhaps remnants from an earlier time, war hawks seized upon the information to rally the nation to war with the British. The two leading hawks, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, were both influential institutionalists in D.C. The two men weren't alone in catching war fever, as expansionists greatly desired shifting the boundaries of the United States into Canada, as well as taking over Spanish-held Florida and the southern areas of what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Americans in the South had been urging annexation since 1810, when American settlers had illegally seized a Spanish fort in Baton Rouge. Madison had hastily agreed to the fort's annexation as the current boundaries of the United States lacked waterway thoroughfares to the all-important Gulf of Mexico. Southern slave advocates, such as John C. Calhoun, also sought to take over the territory in order to prevent runaway slaves from reaching freedom within Spanish-held lands. Henry Clay ascended to the position of Speaker of the House in 1811 and appointed Calhoun to the all-important Committee on Foreign Affairs. From these lofty government positions, they steadfastly maneuvered the United States into the War of 1812. A huge part of their calculation was the fact that England was consumed in Europe in their war with Napoleon. The conflict had turned into an ugly stalemate, with the British blockading the entire continent of Europe, unintentionally angering the Americans who sought to continue to trade with both sides of the conflict. Madison had attempted to deal with the economic ramifications of the blockade via politics. But the Embargo Act of 1807, in retaliation for continued British impressment of American sailors, backfired, cutting our own GDP by a staggering 5% and reducing our exports from 108 million to a mere 22 million. On June 18, 1812, Madison gave in to the war hawks and approved a congressional declaration of war against England. As was expected, the British initially ignored the war declaration. Unfortunately, the war hawks had neglected to beef up our own military strength before invading the British-held Canada via Detroit. Former President Thomas Jefferson had remarked that the acquisition of Canada this year as far as the neighborhood of Quebec will be a mere matter of marching and will give us experience for the attack of Halifax the next and the final expulsion of England from the American continent. It was a sentiment shared with the sitting Secretary of War, who boasted that we can take Canada without soldiers. We have only to send officers into the provinces, and the people, disaffected towards their own government, will rally round our standard. The war declaration gave a second life to Tecumseh, who quickly allied with the British and worked steadily to push the Americans back, taking over Fort Dearborn in present-day Chicago. The Canadians also mounted a stiff defense of their homelands, showing a spark that the American government hadn't known existed within the frozen North. The American forces were pushed back by Quebec's strong fortifications, but the seeds of their downfall had been sowed long before the actual battle. The American troops had far too many untrained recruits and an incompetent corps of officers. New Englanders, still steaming at the defeat of the Federalist candidate in the prior 3 elections, refused to have their troops used against their northern neighbors. Lastly, British warships patrolled the Great Lakes, making it far more difficult for the Americans to move troops and critical supplies. The Battle of Quebec would end the American campaign for the annexation of Canada. The war took another turn against the United States after Napoleon inexplicably invaded Russia during the winter. The locals' decision to burn Moscow to the ground resulted in the loss of 600,000 of the more than 800,000 troops that he had set out with. The Corsican general further abandoned the survivors in order to return home to Paris in a valiant attempt to stave off a coup attempt. His efforts ultimately failed, resulting in his first exile to the island of Elba. His departure from the main stage allowed the British to finally involve themselves fully in the War of 1812, landing troops just outside of Washington, D.C. on August 24, 1814. As payback for the Americans' torching of the Canadian capital at York, the Redcoats proceeded to burn everything in sight. The lone exception was the U.S. Patent Office, which saw its administrator, Dr. William Thornton, throw himself in front of the cannons as they readied to fire. He implored the British, yelling, "Are you Englishmen or Goths and Vandals? This is the Patent Office, the depository of ingenuity of the American nation in which the whole world is interested. Would you destroy it?" The British Army next proceeded towards Baltimore. Showcasing the lack of preparation within the heart of our nation, the Baltimore governor blocked the British fleet by purposefully sinking several ships to clog the harbor, resulting in a firefight from a distance, the image of which burned into the brain of Francis Scott Key, a Washington lawyer who was aboard one of the British ships seeking to free an American prisoner. He would later put the words of the poem he had written down on an envelope after the event to the tune of a traditional British drinking song in order to produce the Star-Spangled Banner. The British further met stiff resistance in northern New York, convincing them that it was time to open up peace channels. History was on America's side. The British knew that holding land against the willpower of Americans was a futile effort, and having just concluded one war against Napoleon, they were eager for peace. The Treaty of Ghent concluded the war on Christmas Eve of 1814, freezing the U.S.-Canadian border at its pre-war location and agreeing to jointly share the disputed Oregon Territory for the next decade. Unfortunately, the British mostly abandoned their Native American allies, whose confederation had fallen apart after William Henry Harrison's forces had managed to kill Tecumseh while fighting in Michigan. Having again encouraged American slaves to rise up against their masters, the British once again remained true to their word and resettled newly freed black men and their families in Canada. News, however, traveled at a different speed during this time period. General Andrew Jackson had received no news regarding the Treaty of Ghent. Jackson had risen to the position of general after viciously pursuing members of the Creek tribe rather than following orders to invade Spanish-held Florida. The resulting Battle of Horseshoe Bend goes down as one of the American Army's worst moments, as Jackson's soldiers slaughtered indigenous women and children. Andrew Jackson himself ordered such brutal measures, proclaiming that the laws of war did not apply to conflicts with savages. Historian Ned Blackhawk points out that in his mind he was fighting Indians and runaway slaves, not foreign nations. From a utilitarian viewpoint, Jackson's actions worked, as the massacre broke the will of the Creek and Cherokee peoples. For our future president, it was a mere preview of the devastation that Jackson would wrought on the southern indigenous tribes. Having received a promotion for his efforts, General Jackson turned his forces to engage a newly landed contingent of battle-hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, which had just landed near New Orleans. Totally unaware that peace had been declared, the two forces collided on January 8, 1815, with what historian Alan Brinkley refers to as a motley collection of Tennesseans, Kentuckians, Creoles, blacks, pirates, and regular army troops. Jackson had assembled earthen bulwarks in order to give his men the high ground. After raining down grape shot and canister bombs on the massed British formations, the smoke cleared to reveal a mere 72 American casualties, to go with the nearly 3,000 British casualties. It was a fitting end to the war, as the battle, which never should have happened, served to make Andrew Jackson a star, eventually propelling him to the Oval Office itself. He, along with William Henry Harrison, utilized this war to eventually achieve the presidency. While it would propel both to the nation's top office, it would prove to be the final undoing of the party of Washington and Adams, as the leaders of the out-of-power Federalist Party convened in Hartford, Connecticut, to consider their options for a coup d'etat against President Madison and the Democratic Republicans. The more extreme members at the convention argued in favor of the northeastern cluster of states seceding from the Union, but they were outvoted by a sizable moderate majority. Their meeting was outed by the Federalists themselves. With the war going badly, they seized the initiative to release a set of demands, which included the right of nullification and proposing 7 amendments to the Constitution, which were all designed to protect the New England region from the growing influence of the South and the West. Sectionalism had at this point reared its ugly head, as the differences between the North and South were clear for all to see. Yet shortly after this bold maneuver, the nation received word that the Treaty of Ghent had ushered in a peace agreement which allowed the U.S. to credibly claim victory in the War of 1812. After that news was followed by the total victory of General Jackson at New Orleans, the Federalists' blackmail scheme turned upon them, delivering a death blow to the party. Madison handed off the Democratic-Republican baton to his Secretary of State, James Monroe, in 1817. Federalist candidate Rufus King only managed 34 electoral votes across 4 northern states against Monroe's incredible 183. As the stain of the Hartford Convention clung to the dying party, Monroe's presidency ushered in the era of good feelings, as the remaining Federalists got the message and abandoned the party for good. The lack of a rival party allowed Monroe and his administration to put the country first. Brinkley writes that Monroe was 61 years old when he became president. In the course of his long career, he had served as a soldier in the Revolution, as a diplomat, and most recently as a cabinet officer. He entered office under what seemed to be remarkably favorable circumstances. With the decline of the Federalists, his party faced no serious opposition. With the conclusion of the War of 1812, the nation faced no important international threats. American politicians had dreamed since the first days of the Republic of a time in which partisan divisions and factional disputes might come to an end. In the prosperous post-war years, Monroe attempted to use his office to realize that dream. Rather than rubbing his victory in the face of the out-of-power New Englanders, Monroe selected John Quincy Adams, son of the nation's second president, as his Secretary of State, a position that had previously been held by the likes of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. War hawk Henry Clay was offered a promotion to Secretary of State, but declined in order to continue to wield power within the House, a decision that led to fellow hawk John C. Calhoun to ascend to the position of Secretary of War. Fresh off of their second victory over the elite British military, the United States was finally ready to flex its muscles, with the president issuing the Monroe Doctrine, which proclaimed that the Americas were off limits to external meddling by European powers. Such rules, of course, didn't apply to America itself, which fully intended to meddle within the territories which many American officials believed constituted their backyard. A number of revolutions against European colonizers, particularly the Spanish, had created a number of new nations which remained vulnerable to recolonization. Sensing the sea change, the Spanish negotiated with Quincy Adams over Florida. Utilizing both a carrot and stick, Monroe's Florida policy resembled Teddy Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine of speaking softly while carrying a big stick. Adams, as Secretary of State, worked behind the scenes to gain Florida diplomatically. Meanwhile, Calhoun, operating as Secretary of War, was privately commanding Andrew Jackson to the Florida border. Jackson's orders were to do whatever he believed necessary to prevent Seminole raids emanating from Florida. Jackson, however, is the type of soldier who saw every problem as a nail. Utilizing his hammer, he moved his forces across the Spanish border to pursue what became known as the Seminole War. The ease of the crossing made it quite clear to the Spanish that the United States was more than capable of seizing Florida by force if it chose to do so. The result was the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, whereby Spain ceded all of Florida as well as most of its claims to territory north of the 42nd parallel in the Pacific Northwest. As part of the negotiations, America dropped its claims to portions of Texas. Little could anybody have realized that this would be the point in which the bottom fell out for the Monroe administration. In 1819, a run on the banks resulted in a cascade of failures across the state banking system. 6 years of economic depression would ensue, hitting settlers in the West particularly hard. They specifically blamed the National Bank for the depression, setting up a fight which would consume Jackson's presidency, something that we'll cover in our next episode. The expansion to the West also set up more sectional conflict, as Missouri was ready to enter the Union and desired to do so as a slave state. That would upset the balance between the 22 states of the Union, 11 of which had already outlawed slavery. Rather than address the peculiar institution right then and there, Henry Clay brokered a deal to combine the admission of Missouri with the acceptance of Maine, which had previously been just a region of Massachusetts. The Missouri Compromise, as it came to be known, also drew a line along the 3630 parallel in order to preserve the compromise, as territories acquired in the Louisiana Purchase achieved the benchmarks for admission to the Union. Although we would look at it as merely kicking the Civil War down the road, both sides celebrated the compromise as the alternative appeared far worse, with Thomas Jefferson briefly coming out of retirement to claim that this momentous question of the expansion of slavery, like a fireball in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. Monroe's government was actively working to settle and develop the new territories, with cities popping up along the plentiful rivers of the lower Midwest. The government issued private charters for companies to construct transportation routes out west. Rivers were the main mode of transportation, with the government working to dredge out rivers to connect Cincinnati, Louisville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis to the port city of New Orleans. The power of eminent domain, which the government used to seize privately owned land, resulted in the building of dams which powered water-driven machinery, which was driving the expansion to the west. By the 1820s, a Commonwealth system had been created, one which funneled state aid to private businesses whose projects would improve the general welfare of the people of the United States. Congress provided little oversight, with Henry Clay explaining that he could care less if 3% of the funding ended up illegally in the pockets of a private company, as long as the American citizen received benefits in the range of 15 to 20% of their personal spending. New territories resulted in new interpretations of republicanism, with Ohio deciding to specifically disenfranchise African Americans, despite the fact that the territory and state had outlawed the despicable practice of slavery. New York followed 2 decades later by restricting voting privileges to black men who owned property. Meanwhile, neighboring New Jersey disenfranchised women after their 1776 state constitution had explicitly granted them the right to vote if they owned property. In explaining their reversal, the legislators of Jersey claimed that women generally are neither by nature nor habit, nor education, nor by their necessary condition in society fitted to perform this duty with credit to themselves or advantage to the public. At the same time, however, American parents generally stopped the practice of picking their children's future spouse, as sentimentalism, a branch of the larger European Romantic movement, spread through all classes of American society. Husbands still held the balance of power within the relationship, yet several states added drunkenness and personal cruelty to the acceptable legal grounds for a woman to obtain a divorce. Women at this time period delivered on average 6 children during their lifetime. As incredible as that sounds, it was a reduction from the 8 or 9 that their parents had been forced to bear. This decline in the birth rate resulted in a major demographic transition. With thousands of young men traveling out west to find their fortune, more and more women delayed their marriage, resulting in a reduction in the number of childbearing years during which they were married. Others, via early forms of birth control or through abstaining from marital relations, put off having children altogether. This sudden change scared a number of individuals who attempted to reinstall the concept of Republican motherhood, which sought to have mothers engrave the love of liberty and freedom within the hearts of their children. The parent's role, particularly the mother, was to develop their child's conscience, self-discipline, and a sense of responsibilities, while still making them independent. This Republican motherhood, however, was lost upon the farm families of the Republic, particularly Baptists and Methodists, who sought to raise their children in an authoritarian manner, expecting them to adhere to strict rules and harsh discipline in order to prevent the stain of sin upon their souls. American culture, it seems, was in flux, with Noah Webster asserting that America needed its own dictionary in order to distinguish the unique meanings regarding American institutions like Congress versus the traditional British understanding of Parliament. Washington Irving authored Rip Van Winkle, as well as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. His literary success allowed America to assert that its culture was as highbrow as the European continent, which it had separated from. Meanwhile, the South continued to languish in the past, as its established aristocracy maintained the status quo. Enslaved African Americans were 1/3 of the total population of the South, their bondage a visible sign that America was not living up to its founding ideals of liberty and equality. To preserve their privileged social position, Southern leaders redefined republicanism to suit their needs. By restricting individual liberty and legal equality to just whites, they created a Herrenvolk republic, akin to establishing a master race. Although the focus is entirely upon the planter class, a small minority of the population, most of the South didn't participate in the institution of slavery. The South had a higher rate of poverty, which coincided with little access to a suitable education. At the time, the South was known primarily for rude manners, heavy drinking, and a poor work ethic, with one writer claiming at the time poor whites in the South only had a passion for gaming at the billiard table, a cockfight, or cards. Many had begun to wonder aloud if the presence of slavery had resulted in white men learning to despise the institution of work. The abolitionist movement found its beginning during this time period, with Bishop Richard Allen providing a unique perspective on the peculiar institution. Allen had been born into slavery in 1769, before being sold to a farmer in Delaware, where he was converted to Methodism. His owners became convinced that slaveholders would be found guilty of sin beyond redemption upon Judgment Day. They therefore allowed Allen to purchase his freedom. He did so only after borrowing money from the Methodist Church, which installed him as a pastor until he was able to pay off his debt. Now somewhat free and minister, Allen proclaimed that men like him had to do everything to make it a more perfect union, stating that this land which we have watered with our tears and our blood is now our mother country. In 1798, he formed a separate black congregation known as the Bethel Church, and in 1816, Allen became the first bishop of the newly created African Methodist Episcopalian Church. Within 2 years, he had 3,000 black members attending his sermon, which was designed to condemn colonization while attempting to claim the inalienable rights of American citizenship for all of his African American brothers and sisters. The Second Great Awakening's increase in evangelical Christianity gave new public roles for Northern white women as a convergence of factors, including Enlightenment principles, wartime needs, and Baptist ideology eliminating most state support for religion. Southerners quickly co-opted the movement to ensure that they remained atop the rigid hierarchy, putting themselves beneath God, but ahead of human farmers, as well as their slaves who were instructed by Southern preachers to remain submissive, faithful, and obedient. Black Christians, however, adapted Protestant teachings to their own needs, ignoring the concepts of original sin and predestination in order to envision a Christian God which was a warrior who had previously liberated the Jewish people from enslavement beneath the Egyptians. The Christian teachings even found their way into a number of rebellions, with Brother Gabriel invoking the Bible to encourage an uprising in Virginia. He pointed out to his adherents that he had read in his Bible where God says, if we worship him, 5 of you shall conquer 100, and 100 of you 100,000 of our enemies. Clearly, the era of good feelings which Monroe had initially presided over had been a mere mirage. He had been unopposed during his re-election campaign, but now a number of would-be upstarts were challenging the party's will that William Crawford of Georgia, the sitting Secretary of the Treasury, followed in Monroe's wake. The election that would come about in 1824 was one for the ages, fracturing the nation and establishing the second-party system of the United States. We'll explore that era of American history in depth in our next episode.